All right. Good evening, family. Welcome to another IKG Wisdom Wednesday. I am Sister Ajwa, IKG Wisdom Wednesday coordinator, and we are so happy and pleased that you are here joining us this evening for a what will prove to be a great presentation and knowledgeable and informative session. Before we get started, just wanted to go over some reminders that this is a webinar, so all videos are automatically off and microphones are muted. If you want to engage the speaker and the audience, please feel free to do that in the chat. However, if you have a direct question for our speaker that you would like answered, please type your questions in the Q&A box. We will take questions from the Q&A box. As always, we like to welcome people from all over the world. We're talking about the Global African Diaspora today, and we definitely have a representation of that. So we just want to recognize our family checking in from, let's see, we have Maryland, we have Cape Girardeau, we have Canada, Texas, California, Panama, Louisiana, let's see, Indianapolis, Indiana, New Jersey, New York, Trinidad and Tobago, Michigan, Minnesota, Chicago, New York, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Bowie, Maryland, um, let's see, Connecticut, Oregon, Ohio, California. So Brooklyn, New York. So we are checking in from all over the globe. So thank you all again for being here today. So for those who may be new to Wisdom Wednesdays is a free lecture series hosted by IKG, and it's held every third Wednesday of the month. And for about the past almost year, we've been holding these Wisdom Wednesday sessions via Zoom webinar, and we're going to continue to do that for a little good while. So we thank you for joining us, and we invite you to invite others to this series. So we invite you to go to our website, uh, ikgculturalresourcecenter.com, to sign up to receive notifications about our program. So tonight, we are very pleased to have with us Dr. Sheila Walker speaking on Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, a Global African Diaspora documentary discussion. The documentary, Familiar Faces, Unexpected Places, a Global African Diaspora, offers an expansive vision of what, where, and who the African diaspora is, highlights African knowledge and technologies that developed the Americas, and reveals similarities and differences between African diasporan communities in distant lands. Tens of millions of Africans were involuntarily scattered throughout the world during centuries of enslavement. The African diasporan communities that resulted contributed to the creation of the new societies of the Americas and added new presences to old societies elsewhere. Torn from the world they knew, Africans and their descendants preserved ancestral worldviews to which they adapted the cultures of those they encountered to create dynamic fusions that enrich global civilizations. Join us tonight as we view this documentary and is led in a discussion by the filmmaker, Dr. Sheila Walker. Dr. Sheila Walker is a cultural anthropologist and documentary filmmaker who has done field research, lectured, and participated in cultural events in most of Africa and the global African diaspora. She is the executive director of the nonprofit Afro Diaspora Incorporated, in which her goal is to share her experiences and knowledge of known and lesser known peoples and cultures of the global African Diaspora. I will type her website in the chat, but at this time, I would like for you all to join me um, in welcoming Dr. Sheila Walker. Welcome, Dr. Walker.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here for Wisdom Wednesday. And of course, it's nicer when we're all physically together. But, you know, the fact of being able to be together virtually allows people who can't be physically present to be present anyway. So there are advantages to what we would generally see as kind of a disadvantage. So why, let's see, I love this documentary. And part of the reason I love it is that it allows me to travel around the world and see the people I consider my global African Diasporan family, and to see what they're doing and what they're thinking about things. I began to learn about the Global African Diaspora. It's not present in this documentary. I showed another one back when we could get together for Wisdom Wednesdays, called Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora, that talked about how I began to get to know this global African diaspora. I went to Cameroon as an exchange student when I was in college. I was the only colored girl in my class, so I needed a little balance, and I found that balance in spades in the Bamoun Kingdom in Cameroon, where I lived with a family. And, you know, I was realizing that my Cameroonian father gave me one sentence the first day I was there in Fumban, speaking my best college French, of course. And he took me into the living room. He showed me the furniture, and he said, "This furniture is not European. It's Bamoun." And I thought, huh? Furniture? I didn't know that furniture could have an identity. Well, now I know. Now I know. Now I know. I mean, you can see around me, okay? There's an identity going on here. And so what that sentence told me was that Europe did not need to be our frame of reference. We could have another frame of reference. These Bamoun people, the culture, the history of their kingdom was their frame of reference. And I began to learn that. I'm not saying that my ancestors, my specific African ancestors, were Bamoun. Some of them may have been, I don't know. I'm claiming African ancestors from the Senegal River to Benguela and some more. But I think that the majority of them would have come from that about 5,000-mile region, okay? But so initially I just began to learn about the African diaspora in the Americas. And so I thought it was rather amazing to learn about African descendants in places that, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, places where there were no people of African origin. The problem with that is that it's not true. There's no place in the Americas, no nation in the Americas that does not have a population of African origin, an organized population of African origin. And a country like Chile, right, where it is generally thought, oh, no Black folks in Chile. Well, there are more than 40 Afro-Chilean organizations. And so that's just the Americas. I worked in Somalia on a development project, and I remember standing on the beach in Mogadishu and looking east and thinking, oh, I don't know anything about whatever is on the other side of the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean. I know nothing about Black folks over there. Well, now I do. And I do because there was a conference in 2006 in Goa on the African diaspora in Asia. And when I was invited to this conference, I was so thrilled that I almost bought a ticket for a year too early because I was just so anxious to find out about this African diaspora on the other side of the world. And this all goes back to a map, the African diaspora map done by Dr. Joseph Harris, father of African diaspora studies, historian. Dr. Harris, his map was about 1980, and he did a lot of conferences lectures talking about his map. And his map is full of arrows that people left Africa, mostly involuntarily, but not all, and went to various places, east and west of the continent. I was fascinated. I didn't know that. You know, I had a PhD and nobody told me that. So that map became my mental map of places I needed to get to know, to know my extended African family. And so ever since, I've been following Joseph Harris's arrows. Now, one of the interesting things for me is that after having been to Janjira Island that you'll see in the documentary that you're going to see, I asked Dr. Harris, well, what did you think about Janjira Island? He had talked a whole lot about this place that is an island from which Afro-Indians controlled maritime traffic. And he said, oh, I didn't go there. I said, what? You didn't go there? Here I am following this man around the world, according to his map, right? Well, he didn't go every place, but he said, I'm an historian. You're an anthropologist. So as an historian, his job was to go to the archives and learn about these places. Mine as an anthropologist is to follow all those arrows on his map, get on the little boat, go to Janjira Island. Once I've gone to Murud, you got to go to the place where the boat leaves from. So anyway, as a result of essentially of the Joseph Harris map of the global African diaspora, I have felt that it is my mission to follow all of his arrows. And his map has become the way I view the world. I view the world as the global African diaspora. And if we know anything about the peopling of Earth, what we do know is that the people, the modern human beings who peopled the rest of the Earth were Africans. So having said all that, I'm not going to talk in my documentary. I don't talk about that early African diaspora of the first human beings, but it's appropriate for me to now stop talking, show you the documentary so that we can have a discussion afterwards. And my basic questions are, what surprises you in this documentary? What's important in this documentary? For you? How does it change the way you see the world? What does it change about how we think, we as African descendants and other people too? And if it changes how we think, well, how does it change how we act? So without further ado, let me begin to show you, whoops. Let me see. The host has to allow me to share my screen so that I can show you this documentary. Okay, thank you.
Mute your phone.
What's happening? Ese es el famoso bambuco.
Most of the people who laid the foundations of the modern Americas were of African origin. Of the 6.5 million people who crossed the Atlantic during the first 300 of the 500-year history of the modern Americas, only 1 million came from Europe. 5.5 million people were brought from Africa during the inhuman commerce in human lives known as the transatlantic slave trade.
Sheila, can you mute your video? Turn off your video.
Americans were forced to do what?
Yes, if you can turn off your video while your documentary is playing, your video is still on and your audio. If you want to turn your video off while the video is playing.
Oh, I thought I had. So you see me?
I still see you, yes.
Oh, well, how weird. I don't know how to do that. Should I stop the sharing?
Well, no, you can still share your screen. You should see a little small box and with the 3 dots, and you can click on that and it'll show stop video. And you
Yeah.
can stop your video, but still share your screen.
All I see is chat, pin, hide non-video participants, and show self-view. Stop video?
Yeah, stop video.
Ah, okay.
Okay, and then you can press play.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. You can mute
European
yourself.
colonies that became the American republics. Some Africans were selected specifically for their technological expertise. Africans had been working with iron for thousands of years, and their descendants continue to make both useful objects and beautiful works of art.
You look around the wall here, this is some of my work in that 72 years. I went in the blacksmith shop, the shoe hall. I didn't dream I would be making gifts.
African knowledge helped feed the Americas with rice domesticated more than 3,000 years ago in West Africa. U.S. plantation owners asked slave ship captains to bring them skilled rice Negroes. The Portuguese enslaved Africans from what was called the Gold Coast to mine gold in Brazil. They said these Africans, whom they called mining Negroes, had an almost magical luck in finding gold. Luck or expertise?
Toda a tecnologia empregada aqui na extração do ouro, ela é devido a esse conhecimento africano. Eles precisaram dessa mão de obra especializada. Então eles vão numa região específica da África, que é a região que a gente chama de Costa da Mina, né? E já tinha grandes reinos no passado que faziam uso desse ouro, né? Aí a gente fala do reino Achante, né? Do grande reino do Mali também.
Não fosse a presença africana, não fosse o saber e o conhecimento trazido pelos africanos, que embora tenham chegado aqui como mão de obra escravizada, Portugal jamais teria conseguido tirar daqui o volume de ouro que tirou.
In Ecuador, descendants of mining Negroes still pan gold and transform it into beautiful creations like those of their African ancestors. By the end of the 19th century, 12 to 15 million Africans had been scattered throughout the Americas. More than 200 million African descendants now live throughout the Americas, some in unexpected places.
Los afros estamos visibilizándonos, ¿no? Porque obviamente habíamos vivido siempre desde cuando la colonia, pero estábamos como ocultos, ¿no? No estábamos mostrando nuestra identidad, pero ahora estamos muy visibilizados ya, en cambio estamos reconocidos por la nueva Constitución Política del Estado, entonces estamos incluidos en lo que es Bolivia.
Across Africa, people play the game of sophisticated mathematical strategy that in some places is called wari. The game is one of the many elements of their cultures that Africans brought with them to the Americas. Wari is still played in the Caribbean, most prominently on the island of Antigua.
I asked the Prime Minister to tell me one thing that Africans in Antigua have
something tangible that they have now that we brought from Africa. And a woman shouted out in the crowd, "Worry!"
Jawara, who was a math teacher in Antigua, brought his knowledge and skills to the United States. He makes wari boards and plays and teaches the game on the street in Harlem.
Antiguans believe that worry is their game. Some Antiguans believe that there's no other people on earth that plays worry. Okay. So the object of the game is to capture 25 seeds on the opponent's side of the board. To make a play, you would take all the seeds up from any one of your houses. So make a choice, and you place one seed in the next and one.
Yes, I used to play when I was a child. Yes, absolutely. But it's all over when you go to Africa. It's everybody in the street play. It's very common.
People get out to play. You want to play?
You made it, yes, of
So
course.
it's a counting game.
Yeah. That's why everybody in Africa play this because it's very smart.
Antigua is the only place where the players are buried with this board. When they died, they made sure that they took one of these warrior boards to heaven.
Almost half of the Africans who arrived in the Americas came from the Central African region of the Kingdom of Congo. And some African diaspora communities perpetuate Congo royal pageantry. For centuries, the Congo Kingdom was respected in the Atlantic world as an African Christian kingdom. Such esteem was reflected in European artists' portrayals of Congo diplomats. In the Americas, in spite of slavery, African descendants perpetuated memories of royal traditions from the Kingdom of Congo. This reenactment of a 19th century Congo ceremony begins with a contra dance from European royal courts. And quickly segues into much more African rhythms and movements. Afro-Brazilians in the state of Minas Gerais portray the pageantry of the royal courts of the kings and queens of Congo. Delegations come from afar, seeking blessings from Afro-Brazilian Congo kings and queens. In Panama, Congo ceremonies are less formal and more playful, with Congo royals dancing exuberantly to drumming of African origin. Some people characterize Panama's Congo celebrations as a parody of the Spanish monarchy. A more plausible interpretation is that, as elsewhere in the Americas, they represent a continuity of the Congo monarchy. But the African diaspora does not just exist in the Atlantic world or the Americas. It is global. On South Pacific islands that Europeans called Melanesia for the melanin-rich skin of their inhabitants, people whose ancestors settled there thousands of years ago identify with global African diasporan culture. Africans were enslaved on Indian Ocean islands to work on plantations, as in the Americas.
Nous, créoles descendants esclaves dans Maurice, nous pas ici, mais nous ailleurs, partout dans le monde. Comme vous le savez, avec l'esclavage, le peuple noir a été éparpillé à travers le monde, que ce soit aux Caraïbes, en Amérique ou ailleurs, à Maurice, dans les îles de l'océan Indien.
Africans were also enslaved across the Mediterranean Sea to Turkey during the Ottoman Empire.
Bu insanları bir araya toplamanın, bu insanlarla bir arada konuşmanın, bu insanlarla birçok sorunu paylaşmanın yolunun dernek olduğunu bildiğim için dernek girişimi olarak yola çıktım ve 2006 sonlarında Afrikalılar Kültür Dayanışma ve Yardımlaşma adı altında Arkadaşlar 7. Dana Bayramı başlamıştır. Tüm halkımıza Dana Bayramı bir yıl boyunca sağlık, mutluluk ve bol verim vermesini dilerim. Herkesin Dana Bayramı'nı kutlarım.
Renklerimiz bir ya. Renklerimiz bir.
Because we are same color. Our blood is like same. All the black people are celebrating, and she's saying to anyone, we are coming all together. We are seeing each other, talking and sharing something. So she's happy about that.
Her zaman.
India offers a variety of African diasporan experiences that contrast with and complement those of the Americas.
Some people are come from
They just spread out in the forest.
माझे पर्सनल
ते काय झालं तर सोंडी बांधता आले नाही धावताना ते करेक्ट
कर्नाटक
ओबामा सिलेक्ट होने के बाद.
They celebrated the election of President Barack Obama, whom they consider one of their own people, proudly claiming him as an American Siddi. Wherever they were enslaved,
Africans and their descendants resisted bondage. Centuries ago, some of them, referred to as Maroons, escaped to inaccessible places and created autonomous communities. Haiti's citadel is the world's greatest monument to the triumph of an enslaved population. Haitians defeated Napoleon's army, the most powerful army in Europe, to free themselves and create the world's first independent Black republic and the first government to outlaw slavery. On Mauritius and Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean, people enslaved by the British and French escaped to remote highlands to form free communities in rugged environments.
Je pense que le vrai cirque de marronnage à La Réunion, c'est quand même le cirque de Bafat.
Aujourd'hui, nous dans le site culturel, le paysage culturel du monde, c'est qu'à l'époque, durant l'époque de l'esclavage, durant la période française et britannique, il y a à différents moments un groupe d'esclaves qui s'est sauvé depuis que Dieu ben mettre pour venir trouver refuge à la montagne là. Et dans un document historique, avec une interview qui nous fait avec Benjamin qui fait nous qui c'est ce qu'on appelle la République des Marrons qui est installée aux montagnes là. Alors ça, tout ça est bien important parce que le combat des Marrons pour affirmer le statut d'être libre et d'être humain, c'est un combat qui est le premier phénomène dans l'île Maurice. Nous considérons nos ancêtres marrons comme précurseurs, pionniers dans la lutte pour la liberté.
People in Colombia's Palenque de San Basilio celebrate their maroon heritage.
Líder fundador de los palenques, no solamente el palenque San Basilio, sino fue el hombre que junto a entre 36 y 37 hombres y mujeres que fueron desembarcados allí en la ciudad de Cartagena, huyeron hacia los montes y fundaron el palenque San Basilio.
The marimbula is a version of the Central African instrument called mbira, sanza, and other names. In the United States, Harriet Tubman led hundreds of people from slavery to freedom along secret paths of the Underground Railroad. Maintained ancestral worldviews and behaviors. In Salvador, capital of Brazil's state of Bahia, Baba Gore arrived in the village of Ratampur as an agate merchant 800 years ago. Baba Gore also had great spiritual powers, and Siddhis built a shrine in his honor. As guardians of the shrine, they share Baba Gore's blessings with fellow Siddhis and with other Indians. Baba Gore is now worshipped not only by Siddhis, but also by other Indians of various faiths. Because Iberian Catholics dominated the enslaving of Africans in the Americas, several Afro-descendant communities worship Black Catholic saints. Patron saint of Palermo in Sicily, Saint Benedict's parents, enslaved in Italy, were from Ethiopia.
Como somos de la diáspora africana, entonces queremos conocer también las festividades que cada pueblo o región o territorio de esta Suramérica festejan a sus santos negros.
In adopting these saints, Africans and their descendants also adapted them to an African understanding of how to celebrate them joyously. Balthazar, also from Northeast Africa, was the African of the three kings who the Bible said took gifts for the birth of Jesus.
Es un santo negro, como dice ella, como nosotros, que nos identifica en realidad porque es un santo que nosotros consideramos que es un santo de los afrodescendientes. No puede ser de otro color, sino como nosotros.
In the community chapel, Balthazar carries an incense burner representing his gift of precious incense. Another segment of the Afro-Paraguayan community called Kambakwa, their name coming from the Bakamba people of the Republic of Congo, celebrates a different version of the saint.
El santo negro, como ellos decían, que es San Baltasar, uno de los tres reyes magos. Hace milagros. Hay gente que si ya le pidieron y le cumplieron el milagro, por ejemplo, si alguien está enfermo, le pide y le pide un milagro y le cumple una promesa que se recupere esa persona.
This Balthazar carries not an incense burner, but a drum, called by the Central African Bantu term candombe, that also designates the community's music and dance.
Le gusta todo lo que es el tambor, el baile, todo eso le gusta.
At midnight before Three Kings Day, January 6th, the Kambakwa begin to celebrate their African saint.
El santo candombero, que siempre es en la fiesta de los negros. El santo de los negros es de candombe.
The Kambakwa also organize an annual festival attended by thousands of people, at which they honor their African saint.
Vamos a Canchimalero, vamos a Canchimalero. Bueno, San Martín, con el poder de Dios, el Señor le ha dado el poder y Él hace mucho milagro a nuestra raza. Porque hay muchas personas que sí de verdad les ha hecho milagros y la gente por eso cree mucho en él. Vamos a Canchimalero a buscar a San Martín para celebrar el cumpleaños de él.
Saint Martin de Porres, the only black saint born in the Americas, is famous in his native Peru for his miraculous healing. In river communities in Esmeraldas province in Peru's neighboring Ecuador, Saint Martin also saves people from drowning. The communities organize a river procession to Canchimalero, partying their way to Saint Martin's party.
Como las balsas hacen como forma de concurso, cuál es la mejor balsa, cuál es la que mejor tiene mejor presentación. Entonces, cada parroquia se encarga de que su balsa sea bonita para que tenga buen éxito.
The usual quiet village of Canchimalero explodes when thousands of people converge to celebrate their saint.
Que las personas se comprometen, ¿no? Por algo bueno que les haya hecho, por un milagro.
Yo había viajado en muchos países en África, bastante. Pero la vida, celebrar con alegría, eso es típicamente africano. Esta manera de vivir con la fiesta, con la alegría, eso es puramente africano, la danza.
I'm Sheila Walker, and I'm a cultural anthropologist. My field research with communities of African origin around the world reveals ways in which people, knowledge, and skills from Africa became foundations of new societies. It highlights how African Diasporan Well, I'm sorry about the technical problems, nor do I understand them. This is my first time having that problem. But so I'm very happy that with Ajua's collaboration, we were able to resolve them. And I hope things are functioning now. And I hope that you hear me. I just, when I see that documentary, I'm always just amazed that it exists. When I agreed to do it for a new friend who works at the United Nations, she said, I want a documentary on the global African diaspora. And since I knew that I had a lot of video on a lot of places in the world because I just been there, I said, oh yeah, no problem. Well, then I realized that in order to make a documentary, you need to know how to edit. And I took a 12-hour editing class and thought I knew how to edit. I made a 3-minute trailer that's actually on YouTube. I didn't put it there, but it is there. It was put on by MyPad, and that's cool. So I made a 3-minute trailer. That's very different from making a 30-minute film. And I had to first learn just the technical issues of how to edit. And plus, what story was I going to tell? There's so many stories that one can tell about the global African diaspora. And it was important to me that, you know, I tell a global story because we need to know about our global presence. And so I hope that the idea of our global presence, well, that you got a real sense of that. If you didn't already have it, maybe you did. I love knowing that we're global. I love knowing some of the truths. We've been told a lot of lies about Africans and African diasporans. I was told, for example, that Negroes, that's what we were back then, had no culture. Now, in New York, Penn Station has a new Moynihan Hall. Well, I assume that Moynihan is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who became, I think, a New York senator. Well, he's the same person who wrote Negroes Have No Culture. I quote that in a book of mine. So I'm not so thrilled about this homage to him, given the fact that he helped reinforce negative attitudes toward us, and some of which we have also internalized, which is what's really bad. And it's because we have internalized such negative attitudes about ourselves that it's very important to me to show the truth. For example, we were told, I'm sure if anybody learned anything about the enslavement process, they learned that Africans came to the Americas involuntarily. to do just grunt labor, that they didn't know anything, they didn't have any skills. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Europeans wanted to create new societies, these colonial societies, in somebody else's land, of course, the land of all the indigenous people who lived throughout the hemisphere from Chile to Canada and who aren't here anymore. And so one of the first dynamics in the Americas was the genocide of almost all of the human beings who lived throughout the Americas. And so Africans became a replacement population and a labor force. But so Europeans wanted to create these new societies, and they didn't have the skills to do so. One, they were not tropical people. Most Africans who arrived in the Americas were resettled in tropical parts of the Americas. That makes sense. Plantations, you want to grow stuff. You need to be in places where there is a long growing season. You want to produce crops for export. Well, you need to be someplace where you can produce a lot of crops, hence the tropics. Most Africans wound up in Brazil. We from the United States have acquired this kind of Planet USA version of reality, and we tend to believe that we're the majority of the African diaspora. Totally wrong. That English is the major language of the African diaspora. Equally wrong. Most people in the African diaspora are Brazilian. Brazil, according to its latest census, acknowledges formally, governmentally, that the majority of the population is of African origin by their self-definition, and they don't have a one-drop rule like we do. So on that level, for example, I would say, well, what am I? And, you know, if one looks at me, right? Hair, lips, nose, all that. Clearly, I'm an African descendant. But then sometimes people would factor in the fact that I'm from the United States, a university professor with a PhD. Ah, I'm white. Why? In Brazil, money whitens. Pelé, soccer player. Pelé is a little browner than I am, but Pelé's not really black because he's rich. So money whitens. Unlike in the United States where, you know, nothing whitens. So I like to think that there are comments and questions, perhaps corrections, suggestions, additions in the Q&A to which I should respond. And I think that, Ajwa, are you there?
I am here.
Okay. So,
all right. Okay.
Let's make this a discussion.
Yes. Okay. So everyone in the audience, thank you again for being here. And as you just heard, we want to make this as much of a discussion as possible. So we are inviting you to type in questions into the Q&A box. And let's start off with a question by Michelle. She says, thank you for bringing your knowledge tonight. Can you share your thoughts on using the term pan regarding the diaspora?
Pan?
Pan, like Pan-African.
Oh yeah, well, I use it. Yeah, when I went to Africa, I was 19 and I lived with a wonderful family that talked about Pan-Africanism. And their attitude was that Africans had something in common, that they were a vastly extended family. And that's where, I mean, when I went to Africa, I didn't really see Africans as my family. I wasn't hostile to them. I just was absolutely ignorant. This was the era of Tarzan. You know, I knew Africans, right, from television. But those Africans I saw on Tarzan, I didn't think they were related to me. Of course, they may have been, given that whoever played the Africans on Tarzan were African Americans, so they could have been my cousins. But this family saw Pan-Africanism as a cultural reality, as a political, they thought it should be a political reality, just as it's becoming now with the idea of an African passport or Pan-African passport with the African, what's it called, Free Trade Zone, AFCTA, Commercial Trade Alliance, I think maybe that's what it's called. So they saw Africa as a unit, as heads of state like Kwame Nkrumah, for example, saw Pan-Africanism as what should unite Africa. And this family I lived with also saw us in the diaspora in the Americas as part of their extended family. They asked me, for example, do you know Sparrow from Trinidad? And I thought, why should I know Sparrow from Trinidad? I'm from Jersey. Do you know Pelé from Brazil? No, I didn't know Pelé from Brazil. I didn't know anything about soccer. Well, what they were telling me was that I was part of a larger unit of African origin and that I should know those folks as cousins. And after all of my experiences in Africa, in the African diaspora, I do indeed understand those folks elsewhere in the Americas, Chile to Canada, as cousins. Why? Pragmatically, it just may be true. When we think about how Africans were brought to the Americas, how African families, African ethnic groups were scattered throughout the Americas, one of the things I learned in doing some family research is that my father's grandmother, the Indian, remember how we all have these Indian Native American ancestors? Well, she, the Indian, you know, with the long wavy hair, her last name was Congo. So when I was in Chota Valley in Ecuador and I met people named Congo, what am I supposed to say? Hola primo, hi cousin. Because given the way Africans were scattered throughout the Americas, it is logical that my extended African families would be scattered throughout the Americas. So I think that's a great basis for us to see ourselves as we in the Americas are the real Pan-Africans because our ancestors came from every place. I mean, I know that people are doing their DNA now, and I think that's very good. And they're finding that they have one ancestor from here, one ancestor from there, and that's all good. Except I want more ancestors than that. And I know I had a whole bunch of ancestors, you know, 8 generations ago, right? So I'm claiming from the Senegal River to Benguela, about 5,000 miles of African ancestors. So yes, Pan, I love the word Pan-African, and I talk about Pan-American African diaspora culture. And that does, I don't limit us to the Americas, as you saw, you know, India, Turkey, can't exclude them, they're there. And they're becoming increasingly conscious of their Pan-African existence because they're learning more about who we are, where we are in the world.
Okay, thank you. Robert asked, and I'll kind of combine his questions. If you can speak about the African presence or the presence of Black people in America prior to the slave trade, referencing the Olmecs and the Africans who came before Columbus.
I wish I could say more about that. So I'll say what I think and what I think I know. I read von Sertima, of course, they came before Columbus, and I read about, and I had heard about the Olmec heads, and then reading von Sertima let us know that some of them, he didn't say all of them, were visibly of African origin. And he cited historical knowledge in Africa, historical knowledge in the Americas that made that connection. I went to the museum in Jalapa, and there are lots of Olmec heads in the museum in Jalapa. They don't all look African, just like von Sertima said. But I wanted to see Olmec heads outside of museums. Now that's not so easy because they were buried when they were not found littering the earth. No, most of them were buried. But I was told about a head in Santiago Tuxtla, south of Veracruz. And so I took the bus, went to Santiago Tuxtla, and met the person who was supposed to know about this. And he took me to a little museum in which there was some huge thing wrapped in plastic because they were painting. And he had the plastic taken off this huge thing. And I mean, I was breathless because one of the things von Sertima talked about was the head that had the braids. Okay. And so as I walked around this big Olmec head that looked like a brother in a football helmet, like a lot of them look like, that was the head with the braids. It was the Nestepe head. And so I was so flabbergasted that I almost forgot to ask the obvious question, can I film this? And so I did get to film this Olmec head with the braids. And one of the explanations given in Mexico for the Olmec heads is that what they represent is not human beings, not Africans. No, they represent jaguars. Jaguars. I don't think jaguars look so much like people, but anyway, you know, they're cats, right? And so seeing the Nestepe head with these braids You ever try to braid cat hair? That's not easy. That doesn't work. But so some of the explanations that are trying to disprove the African presence are absurd. It's hard to disprove stuff that's real.
Okay. Can you share more information? This is coming from Helen. Can you share more information on the Maroons, especially the Maroons in the United States?
Yeah. Well, we were told that there were no Maroons in the United States. And until relatively recently, there was very little research on resistance to enslavement in the United States. So, you heard about perhaps Palmares in Brazil, as if there were only Palmares and not maybe 4,000 additional Maroon communities in Brazil, in addition to Palmares. Palmares is the best known one. It existed for about 100 years between 1605 to 1695. All those different Maroon groups up the rivers in the interior of Suriname and French Guiana. Colombia is known for one Maroon community, Palenque de San Basilio or San Basilio de Palenque. One? How much sense does that make? It's just not true. In the Montes de Maria, where Palenque is still found, there are lots of communities that are aware of their Maroon heritage. So in the United States, we were told that didn't exist. There's research going on right now in the Dismal Swamp between Virginia and North Carolina on Maroon communities that lived in the swamps. I mean, you couldn't be a Maroon and live near European settlements, right? And so to be a Maroon, you had to be able to escape, to go to a remote place. And so if you look at the Maroon communities in the Americas, they're on top of hills like Palmares. They're in forested areas like Palenque de San Basilio in Colombia. They're up rivers. And if you look at the rivers in Suriname, where the Maroon communities are above cascades. So it's hard to go up those rivers. I went to a place in Panama, in the archipelago, the Pearl Archipelago in the Pacific. This community is called La Guinea. And to get there, you have to go up a river. And what's fascinating is when you get up to the top of that river, you can't leave because the river is tidal. And so you have to go early in the morning, or you can't go. You have to go early in the morning when the tide is coming in, so that the tide takes you up that river. But then the tide goes down. So your boat is stuck in the mud. So imagine these folks escape there, they create their communities there, someone's coming to attack them. Really difficult, okay? And the attackers get there, they're stuck, they can't leave. So in the United States, Africans and African descendants were a relatively small part of the population. That's really important to know. And there weren't but so many places to escape to. But where did they escape to? On the East Coast? Swamplands in general. So there are now beginning to be archaeological studies. In the Dismal Swamp studies, what is being found is there were not a lot of material remains. But there is evidence that there were, for example, rice plantations. Well, a rice plantation doesn't take a couple of weeks, right? So if you find the remains of rice plantations, you know that people were surviving in that kind of not really friendly environment for years. So there's not enough research. We were told that it didn't happen. We were told that a lot of stuff didn't happen. And so more of us need to do that kind of research as archaeologists, essentially.
Okay, thank you. Marilyn asks, why was the Congo the place of origin on the continent for many in the American diaspora? Was that location accidental or strategic?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Let's see. First of all, the area of the Kingdom of Congo, Banza Congo was the capital of the Kingdom of Congo, and it's in the north of what is now Angola. So, all those countries, those independent nations in Africa are all artificial. They were created in Berlin in 1885 at the Treaty of Berlin. That's when Europe carved up Africa into its German, Portuguese, French, Spanish, English, Italian colonies. But so the Kingdom of Congo was a very important kingdom in Central Africa from the, I'm not an historian, I kind of don't always remember the centuries properly, but from I think the 13th to the 16th, 17th or so century. And Congo had ambassadors, as you saw, right, in Europe, in Brazil. So Congo was considered an African Catholic kingdom. It had prestige and it was well thought of. But once the Portuguese started trading with the Congo, then they decided that they wanted more than the stuff that the Congo could export. They also wanted human beings. And so what did they do? You know, they armed people against each other, but the Congo kingdom remained powerful, but it also sold folks. And so half of the Africans, about half, 45%, who survived the trip to the Americas were from the area of the Congo Kingdom. Now, that's a large area. Now, that's from Angola to southern Gabon. So that whole Central African area is the basis of the African descendant populations of the Americas. Hence, all of us, Chile to Canada, have some culture of Bantu origin. Bantu is not an ethnic group, it's a language family. Well, how do we know in the United States? One of the things we eat is called gumbo. Gumbo is the Proto-Bantu term for okra. Okay. In Chile, there's a place called Lumbanga. Okay, another Bantu term. So we have all this evidence of our Bantu heritage. My great-grandmother, Amelia Congo. So that's why it's not that, let's see, there are areas, you know, Africans were not brought from every place along the coast. Part of it is who has a deep water port? Where could a ship be moored? And where were there population concentrations? If you go to some place that's very dry, you're not going to have a lot of people, right? You go to a place that has fertile soil, a lot of agriculture, you have a dense population from which you can take people. And the Europeans played Africans against each other, arming this group against that group, or vice versa. So of course it was in the interest of each group to be the group that was armed, as opposed to the group that was the victims of those who were armed by Europeans who said, okay, I've armed you, give me this many people.
Okay. William Scott asked, in the places visited, beyond the genotypical and phenotypical realizations, where do you see the most African retentions, either through synchronization or other means, maybe linguistically?
One problem is the absence of research on exactly that. For example, so where most of the research has been about the continuum of culture of African origin is the Americas. Some places in the Americas, not all places in the Americas. In the Americas, most of that research has been done in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, not the United States. We were told that that didn't exist, that we did not have culture of African origin. Colombia, not a lot of research. But so Brazil, Cuba, a little bit about Trinidad. As a result of my research in those other places, I can see so much of the Africanity of our culture, US African Americans who were told formally that we had no African heritage, no culture. If we don't have any culture, who is contributing all of this culture to what is considered US culture, right? Jazz, the only classical music created in the Americas. Whose culture is that? I believe it's African American. So many of our foodways, it may be called Southern, it may be called Creole. Whose foodways are those? Foodways that give us names of things like okra gumbo. Told you about gumbo, okra, nkuru, in Akan, the Akan language family from Ghana. So that word has a doubly African name, okra gumbo. Both words mean that same okra pod. So we, US African Americans, we need to know about other African-based cultures in the Americas so that we can see ourselves. For example, when I was a little girl, right, I went to a church and saw those ladies getting happy when the music got hot. And I didn't get it. I thought it was fascinating. I didn't think it was weird. I just thought, wow, I want to know more about this. What an interesting spiritual manifestation. But I didn't get it. When I asked people, what's this? Oh, they got happy. They were filled with the Spirit. Yeah, okay, but what's the Spirit? Where does Spirit come from? Why does Spirit act like that? I wanted more of an explanation. When I went to an Orisha ceremony in Brazil, I didn't need those explanations based on Christianity anymore. When I saw those women receive the Orishas, embody, incorporar the Orishas, manifesta the Orishas, I recognized the body language. I got it. I understood that in some places, the Africanity has remained flagrant. And in other places, it's remained much more subtle and unacknowledged, but it's here. And so if we learn more about others in the Americas and Africa, of course, then we can see our own Africanity in the United States that we have learned to deny, but it's there. And we just need to learn how to recognize it.
Okay, building off of that comment, I'm going to share a comment from Nancy and kind of turn it into a question. She says, thank you for your wisdom and knowledge. She noticed that there are other Black folks that look like us and they worship someone that looks like them. Why is that important? Or can you speak to the importance of that? She knows that it is important, but can you add to that and why it's important?
Sure.
I mean, conversations that might have been had in your travels around their spiritual worship.
Yeah, if we think that there is a creator who created humanity in his or her or their image, because everybody doesn't believe in this idea of Father, God, this man. There are people who believe in Africans, who believe in the original parents, the mother and the father. You get to have two. But the idea is that they created people in their image. And so for us to learn that the creator doesn't look like us, that really doesn't make very much sense. I did some research on a church in Ivory Coast, the Harris Church, and this is an early 20th century colonial phenomenon. They're African Christians, except, well, Christ isn't really a part of things, but that's a detail. Their prophet is the prophet Harris. And one of the things they say is that the creator had several sons. They were sons, according to the Harris Church, and he sent different sons to different people. And so, for example, Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, was colonized by the French. And so I love this story that Jesus's French son, God's French son, Jesus, was sent to France, of course, because he was French. Those are the Europeans that these Ivorians know. And Harris, who was an African, was the son of the creator sent to the Africans. So people in the world understand that the creator is, if they're the children of the creator, well, then they must look like the creator and their image of the creator, assuming there is an image. Everybody doesn't have an image of the creator. But if there's a creator whom one can visualize, the creator must look like themselves. It's just logical. And an interesting manifestation of this is in the town of Cachoeira in Bahia, in Brazil, where there is a Catholic feast for the Catholic Feast of the Assumption, when the Virgin Mary is assumed into heaven. The women who are members of the Sisterhood of Good Death, that's an Afro-Brazilian lay sisterhood. There are people who say they're Catholics, nuns. They're not nuns. These are women with kids and husbands and stuff. Plus, they're all priests or initiates in the Afro-Brazilian religion. They have processions in which they carry the Virgin Mary. Well, if you look at the Virgin Mary, well, she's Chinese. So, well, why is the Virgin Mary Chinese in this Afro-Brazilian pageantry in this small town in Bahia? Well, it's logical. The Portuguese, right? They were the colonizers of Brazil. They were also the colonizers of Macau in Asia. Macau is really part of China. And so priests came to Brazil from Macau. They brought some of these statues. The Chinese knew what Jesus looked like. They knew what Mary looked like. They knew what St. Lazarus looked like. They were Chinese. So of course it makes sense that the creator or creators should have the same kind of image, assuming there's an image and everybody doesn't believe in that, as his or her or their children.
Okay. Kiana asks, can you speak to the Moorish presence in Italy, Spain prior to slavery? And is it easy to distinguish between Moorish presence prior to the slave trade and those thereafter? Also, how can we distinguish in India the presence of the Dravidians and the Africans brought there via the slave trade?
Okay, let me start with India because it's easy. I had an experience with an Afro-Indian whom you saw, the Juge, who said, we are African Indians. He, one of the things he does, he's a scout for Bollywood, because Bollywood, major film producer, Bollywood sometimes wants people who are visibly of African origin to play roles as Africans. And we were someplace in Karnataka, where he's from, in the southwest of India, where there is the Afro-Indian population who you saw. And he told a woman to take off her scarf so that her hair could be visible. One of the terms I heard, and I would like to know more about this, for obviously African hair is kingri. Sounded a little familiar to me. So the people who are of visible African origin now, the people who are referred to as Siddhis, the people who have a sense of their African origins, because these are African origins that are maybe 800 years old, not 40,000 years old. It's hard to remember 40,000 years ago. So this new population whom you saw, they're relatively new to India, and they're from different parts of Africa. They have, I mean, they're all parts from East Africa, but different parts of East Africa. They have different experiences in India. They speak different Indian languages, different Indian scripts, and but they're all called Siddhis. Siddhi being the term for African Indians. So they are different, and some people assume that they are part of the category of people referred to as Dalits, formerly called untouchables. No, totally separate, just a totally separate issue. What is their status? Some of them have the status of scheduled, they're called scheduled castes, I think, in India. And what that means is they've been designated as having access to affirmative action kinds of programs. This is not global for Afro-Indians, it's specific to certain ones. To speak of the African presence in Europe prior to the beginning of enslavement in the Americas, one way in which that's visible is there are all these Black virgins in different places in Europe. And who are they? Well, it seems like they're descendants of Isis. I went to Greece, and I really want to go sailing, but I'm an anthropologist, right? So I have to have some sort of academic reason to go places. And so I said, well, I'm going to look for Black Athena, Martin Bernal's book, Black Athena, about the African presence in Southern Europe prior to the involuntary African presence in Southern Europe. And I was on the island of Delos, that in the Cyclades, that is essentially an archaeological dig. Delos is. So tourists can only go there from certain hours to certain hours, because at other times people are digging. And I didn't expect to find anything special there. What did I find? And I just found my photograph last week, the Temple of Isis. What is it doing there? Well, there's an area that's called the neighborhood of the foreign gods, and there's the Temple of Isis. So Africans were in Europe. They were, first of all, the Moors were in Spain for 800 years before 1492, when they were expelled as a result of the Reconquista, the Catholic reconquest, as they call it. So if they were in Spain, that, you know, the borders were not hard. So if they were in Spain, they were probably in the rest of Southern Europe. And so why there is a saying that I heard in Spain, is that Africa ends at the Pyrenees. So all those Southern Europeans, people who have names like Moreno, Moro, there's a reason for that. And so that Moorish, but what does Moorish mean? It meant African. That Moorish presence in Southern Europe, it was there. It's still obvious in architecture, language. If we think about Spanish, and I'm not talking about a complex Spanish, Spanish 101, the word for orange, naranja, that's Arabic. Ojalá, may it come to pass, that's Arabic. So, and there are lots of those words that are Arabic, but who were those Arabs? The Moors? They came from Africa. What's the remnant of that word, Mauritania, in right north of Senegal, that has a lighter population and a darker population? So, but we don't know so much about that either. That's one of the areas that is really quiet. I went to a bookstore in Spain and I asked in Madrid, right in the center of Madrid, do you have any books about the African presence in Spain? Huh? Oh, what? It was like they didn't know what I was talking about. 800 years. Huh? It's only been since 1492 that the Moors have not run Spain.
Okay. So speaking of books, different people are asking, do you conduct study tours? Do you have books yourself? Any other films? And of course you have other films. If you want to talk about some of your other films, any other scholarly work that you have, and then also do you conduct study tours to different areas in the African diaspora, to different places within the African diaspora?
Yeah, study tours. I have not ever done a study tour. I guess I participated in study tours as the, kind of a scholarly presence, like Bahia, with one group of Presbyterians, for example. So I have not. It's not impossible. It just hasn't happened yet, but there's a lot of stuff that hasn't happened yet. Books, yeah, sure. I have an edited book based on a conference that I organized on the African diaspora in the modern world. The book is called African Roots, American Cultures, Africa and the Creation of the Americas. And my conference in 1996 about what Africans contributed to the creation of the Atlantic world and the modern world was really eye-opening for me. I've been studying the African diaspora, but I learned so much basic stuff at the conference that I organized. That really surprised me. For example, in this documentary, you saw the demographics of the Americas, that the majority of the people who came to the Americas between 1500 and 1800 came from Africa, the huge majority, right? Why didn't we know that? Why were we taught that the Americas was a European creation if almost all the human beings who created all of the Americas didn't come from Europe? They came from Africa. So the perspective of that conference was what we did, not what somebody did to us. One of the people I called to invite from South America said, yes, well, I'll talk about racism in my country. And I said, no, you won't. That's not what I asked you to do. I asked you to talk about the contributions of Africans to the creation of the Americas. If you can do that, you're invited. Otherwise, no, you're not going to come here and talk about racism. Everybody knows about that. It just has a slightly different accent in different places, but racism is racism, okay? But it was at this conference that I organized, 20 years after getting a PhD from the University of Chicago, that I was told was one of the best anthropology departments in the United States. I learned about the demographics of the Americas there. And if you want to know where that information comes from, there's a database, it's online, it's called slavevoyages.org. And it is a register of more than 35,000 voyages of boats that were created to transport human beings as merchandise. Now, how perverted is that? And we were told, I looked back at some papers I had from 20, 30 years ago. Oh, too bad, we can't know which Africans came from where. Well, that's not true at all, and it's illogical. The transport of Africans, the most valuable commodity traded in the Atlantic world, human beings, it was business. Business leaves records. And so in this database, there are it's like all the boats beginning in, I don't know, 1502 or so. The name of the boat, which port did the boat leave from? Liverpool, La Rochelle, Seville, Lisbon. What was the name of the captain? What date? February 12th or February 13th? How many crew members were there? Where did it go in Africa? How many men, women, children did the boat pick up? Where do they go in the Americas? Did anything happen on the boat? Well, things happened. 10% of those boats involved revolts, which cut into the profits of the enslavers. So all this information about the demographics of the Americas, it's available online for free, slavevoyages.org. And I believe that that website translates into other languages. So there is so much we can know. So we can know when a boat left Lisbon, that it went to Soyo, the place on the coast near capital of the Congo Kingdom, how many men, women, children. And these are all good Christians, remember. In the 19th century, more than half of the African human beings enslaved to the Americas were children. Nice folks, right? So there's so much we can know at this point. And to say, oh, we don't know that, well, that's because we haven't looked. And a lot of it is free.
Wonderful. So speaking along those lines, kind of going back to an earlier question, can you speak a little bit more on, from your travels, any evidence or the evidence that you did uncover about the African presence in the Americas pre-colonization or pre-slavery?
Oh, well, yeah. And I also realized that I didn't finish about books and videos. Let me just say another book response. So I learned about the demographics of the Americas. I learned about the African contribution to the modern world. All that at this conference that I organized, from which the book African Roots, American Cultures, Africa and the Creation of the Americas is a product, as is another documentary that I did, Scattered Africa Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora. More recently, once I did that first book, I swore I would never edit a book again. It's easier to just write your own book. But I got a grant from the United Negro College Fund, interestingly enough, to do a project with Afro-Latin Americans, and did a book that with Spanish-speaking Afro-South Americans from all the 9 Spanish-speaking countries in South America, called Conocimiento desde Adentro, los Afro-Suramericanos hablan de sus pueblos y sus historias. So I had to say that in Spanish because it doesn't exist in English. If anybody has an idea of how to get it translated into English, I would love it. Knowledge from the inside. Afro-South Americans speak of their communities and their history. It's also been translated into Portuguese and it's done really well in Brazil. But it is Afro-South Americans from all the countries in Spanish-speaking South America, whether they exist or not. They're the countries where the government says there are no Black folks here, never been any. Argentina, the president at the Davos Economic Summit 2 or 3 years ago said, oh no, we're all European. Well, if they're so European, why is their national dance called tango, a Bantu word? Why was the majority of the population of Buenos Aires of African origin in the early 1800s? Why are there African descended populations in several places in Argentina, to say nothing of Paraguay, Bolivia, Chile? More about the pre-Columbian African presence in the Americas. So one theory is the Senegalese theory, essentially, of Bakary II, who was a younger royal from the Mali Empire, who outfitted 200 ships to see what was on the other side of the big water. And according to von Sertima, there is a parallel story in the Americas of these people, dark people arriving in light boats. So there's that, not very well researched. Okay, not so long ago, I encountered a man from Mali who said he grew up on that story. The oral tradition on which he grew up, it wasn't a story, it was an historical reality. And then there is the prehistoric African presence. And this is also poorly researched, but Brazil, maybe 10 or maybe 20 years ago or so, a skeleton was brought to light. She had been discovered earlier in a place called Lagoa Santa in Minas Gerais, not so far from Belo Horizonte, capital of Minas Gerais, interior state. And this statue, they call her Luzia because of her similar role in knowledge to Lucy, who was in the 70s, right? The oldest humanoid, hominid, right? She's not exactly like us, but she's a lot like us, but she's not a modern human. So this fossil found in Brazil was named for Lucy because of her pioneering role. Lucy has another name. In Amharic, she's called Dinkanesh, meaning you are wonderful. Lucy's about 3.2 million years old, and she was found in Ethiopia. Well, Luzia is not so old. She's maybe 12,000 years old, but she's older than fossils found in the United States. And what is problematic about Lucy and why there's probably not a lot of, Luzia, I'm sorry, why there's not a lot of research about her is that she is said to be not indigenous American, so Native American, people called Indians, but African or Melanesian. Now, African or Melanesian, what does that mean? Well, the first people who left Africa, the settlements of those first people who left Africa, I don't know, 70,000, 60,000 years ago, where are they? Melanesia? The Aboriginal Australians who say, oh no, we're from here. Well, when you've been someplace for tens of thousands of years, the idea that you came from someplace else doesn't really make sense. So there is evidence elsewhere in the Americas of an African presence that predates by thousands of years. The involuntary presence that was the result of the fact that Europeans discovered a place that how many people had discovered before they got here?
Okay, great. So speaking of the global African presence, and you were talking about some of the books that you referenced. Are there additional books that people can refer to on this topic? And along those lines, have you ever, Glenn is asking if you ever worked with Runoko Rashidi regarding the global African presence?
I have not worked with Runoko. I am fascinated by all that he has found and all that he has shared. And so I think that's wonderful. He has given us a basis to look in places that we haven't been told we should look for an ancient African presence. So he's given us a real foundation. So I would love to follow him around and go to some of those places where he's been. As an anthropologist, I'm in the present, so I want to go places where there are live people. And so that's essentially what I do. Books, wow, a lot of books. Anything by Michael Gomez, for example, who created the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. He wrote a book, for example, that I really like called Changing Our Country Marks, which is about how Africans came to the Americas as, they didn't come as Africans, they didn't come as Black people, neither category existed. They came as members of specific African ethnic groups, some of which have changed their name by now or fused with other groups but so he talks about how we got our American, in the Pan-American sense, identities. I think that's really important. I think it's important in helping us to have a world view. And I think that we, particularly we in the United States, we elsewhere in the Americas also, but folks elsewhere have a better excuse than we have in the United States for not knowing very much, in that we've got a lot of books available about all kinds of stuff. Black folks in Canada, the African Americans who went to Canada seeking freedom. What they found was cold, and a lot of them then wound up in Sierra Leone, which is a wonderful story. But in in the Spanish-speaking countries, they don't have a lot of books, so they don't have much access to information. The book that my cousins from the South and I did in Spanish that got translated into Portuguese, I did launchings of that book, and also I showed this documentary that you saw with Portuguese subtitles. I was just astounded at the enthusiasm that people showed for this book. You know, the book is actually rather academic. I mean, it's not boring, I hope, in that it wasn't written by people with academic training. It was written by people who are really passionate about having the opportunity to tell their own stories. But the Brazilians were just, and it wasn't about them, but it was about their neighbors, other Black folks right around them. And I wondered, well, why were they so enthusiastic? Well, part of it was the premise of the book. Conocimiento desde adentro, knowledge from the inside, our telling our own stories from our points of view. So, you know, if we had dealt with colonial perspectives, well, the chapter on Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, Bolivia would have been really short. No, they don't exist. Yet, these folks are really enthusiastic about telling their story. I asked for 20 pages. The person with my favorite name in the Americas gave me 70 pages. And every time I said, can you turn this in? No, I have to go back to the archives. This wasn't somebody who went to the archives. This was somebody who, he's an economist or something. But once he began to find his people in the archives, he had to go back to the archives to find more of his story. And his name is Juan Angola Maconde, Bolivia. When I met him, he said, yo soy Juan Angola Maconde de Bolivia. No tenemos cultura africana. I'm Juan Angola Maconde from Bolivia. We don't have any African culture. I said, Angola Maconde? You invented the name? How do you not have any African culture if you have two last names, two African last names? Oh, so as a result of participating in the process of writing this book, now he would not say that. He would talk about his culture of African origin. And so I think that's really important. And so there's so much now about all kinds of aspects of our culture of African origin throughout the Americas. Juan Angola Maconde did his own book. Marta Salgado Enriquez from Chile did her own book about Afro-Chileans as a result of participating in our book about knowledge from the inside. We're going to tell our own stories for our own purposes.
Okay, so a few questions. People are curious about the African presence in Spain and Portugal. And so I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Did the Moors create the Spanish language, or what was the African, I guess, input in terms of Spanish? And then what are some differences between how Spain and Portugal recognizes its cultural and economic wealth from African people?
I can't distinguish between Spain and Portugal because I don't know that. And sometimes they were the same country under the same under the same royals. But what is, there's a painting called, there was an exhibit at the Sackler Gallery, Asian art at the Smithsonian, that was called Encompassing the World, about Portugal in the world. And Portugal was involved in the bringing of Africans to the Americas more than Spain. Why? Portugal had boats. Spain didn't have boats. Spain had a navy, you had to have boats. And so Portugal was in charge of transporting people from Africa to Spain and to the Spanish-speaking countries in the Americas because they had boats. There's a lot of this stuff that's just pragmatic. But there were, so this painting, Chafariz del Rey, I think the painter is not known. I think he was thought to be Dutch, and this is from sometime in the 1500s, I think, late 1500s. The exhibit was Portugal in Asia, Portugal in the Americas, Portugal in Africa. I walked in to the left, there was this huge painting, Portugal in Portugal. And it was a Chafariz del Rey, the King's Fountain. Okay, fountain in the sense of a place from which people would get water in the 1500s. And there were all these Black folks in the painting. I thought, wait a minute, wait, where are we? What is this? Well, in the early 1500s, 15% of the population of Lisbon, capital of Portugal, was of African origin. And if you look at this painting, what you notice is that this was not about Africans as enslaved people. It is not about Africans as low status people. The Africans were in various societal positions. Right in the foreground, there is an African on a horse with a hat on and the symbol of some sort of Catholic brotherhood. Now, to be on a horse, you know, that's a big deal, right? There are people getting water from the well. There are Black people and there are white people in the same physical stances. There were brotherhood, Catholic lay brotherhoods and sisterhoods. Well, maybe not sisterhoods, maybe I made that up, but brotherhoods, you know, we have to allow for sexism. In Portugal, in Lisbon, and in Spain, particularly the Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Rosary. Our Lady of the Rosary was a Mediterranean saint who became very important among African descendants, first in Angola and then in the Americas, and she still is considered a saint of Black folks, particularly in the Southern Cone, Uruguay, Brazil, she's big. And in the Vatican, for example, Ethiopia, that was the other Catholic or the other Christian kingdom. And so there was like the House of Ethiopia in the Vatican. And this had nothing to do with enslavement. This was spirituality. But there's not a lot of research about that either. In Spain, in Seville right now, a couple of years ago, I went to a church that was a church of an African brotherhood from 1500s, 1600s or so. So that African presence is there. I don't know about the linguistic presence other than the Arabic linguistic presence, except that there is a musical style called Guineos, Guinea, okay? And so Africans played roles in performance in Spain, probably in Portugal also, but I only read about it in Spain. And there is a whole musical style called Guineos that involves using Africanized Spanish. And there are images about, say, the king of Angola who decided to go to Bethlehem to see what was going on. Okay, so it is Africans who said, oh yeah, okay, Christianity, we can do something with that. So there's so much of our story for us to know more about. And it's all over the place, you know, King Arthur and the Round Tables. Well, why didn't they tell us about the African knights around that table?
Okay, and Ngima asked, have you any knowledge or studies of the Garifuna in Belize or Honduras?
Sure. Their story is, and you know, I don't know if there's actual proof of the beginning, but their story is that some ships bringing Africans to be enslaved wrecked off the coast of St. Vincent, one of the islands in, I think it's the Eastern Caribbean. And some Africans made it to land and procreated with indigenous women as a result of which, and this is not very, you know, I don't know that there's a lot of data about this, but as a result of this African presence, there came to be two groups of people on the island, the presumed red Caribs and the black Caribs. The red Caribs being the indigenous people, so presumably Caribs. But they were separate, and you know, they got along okay. The island's big enough was big enough for all of them. Then the British wanted to take over, and so the Garifuna weren't enslaved because there wasn't slavery. There was no plantation economy because the land doesn't lend itself. There was not a lot of flat land on which one could plant sugarcane, for example. That was a big thing in the Caribbean. So when the Garifuna fought against the British, They didn't have the firepower of the British. They lost. Their hero, Satuye, was killed. The Garifuna were exiled first to an amazing island, Baliso, that I was there. It didn't seem to have any water supply. A lot of people died. Thereafter, those who survived being on Baliso were taken to Roatan, an island off Honduras, and just left there to survive as best they could. And they did. At some point, 19th century, a lot of them went to the mainland, to Honduras, especially, more than Belize. And they're still there, and especially Honduras. They have retained more of their culture in Honduras and elsewhere, but they have also maintained some of it in Belize, and they're in Nicaragua, in a place called Livingston, as well as in Guatemala. Livingston is in Guatemala, excuse me. So they're there. They have a language that some people claim is Carib, and that makes sense that there be a lot of Carib in whatever language they would speak, because that was the environment they found themselves in. But it's hard to look at these people who are pretty African looking, not a lot of miscegenation, and think that they are Native Americans, and not wonder about the Africanity of their language. Now, you don't have to wonder about the Africanity of their dance. That's pretty clear. It is not indigenous. It is very Central African, with a lot of, winding of the waist. I'm curious about the language, because the word for human being is Mutu. What is the language for human being in the Bantu language family? That is the language family of the southern half of Africa. Muntu. Bantu is plural. Mu, singular, ba, plural. It means the people. And so that key word in the language of the Garifuna, I think it's African. I don't think it's Carib. I don't think it's indigenous. So I think if they were to look more closely through an African lens, they would acknowledge more of their African ancestry. For example, ancestors. They're the people in the Americas who have most maintained a system of veneration of their ancestors. They have ceremonies, the Dugu and the Chugu. And in the Dugu, I was fortunate to manage to get to a Dugu. The ancestors come back to first of all, tell their ancestors, that their descendants, that they need to stay together and to transmit messages to them. And what is the major behavior in the Dugu? Dancing. Dancing. And there are people who would see dancing as trivial. Well, but if you're dancing for and as your ancestors, how is that trivial? That seems pretty profound if that's the way you enter into contact with the people who brought you into this world and are the basis of who you are and what your culture is all about. They also feed their ancestors in a beautiful ceremony. They prepare all this food, and I was looking forward to tasting it all. Well, it wasn't for me. It wasn't for us, the living. It was for the ancestors. And what did they do with this food? They took it to the ocean, and they went out in boats to feed those people who had been exiled from St. Vincent, who had been hungry on the water, and who are now at the bottom of the ocean. Well, they need to eat. So it's kind of like, the ceremonies in which African descendants take food, flowers, to African spiritual beings and ancestors in the Atlantic. So the Garifuna are a great group of people to want to know more about their Africanity. Plus, they're unique in the Americas in the sense that they have a language, and that their story is a different story. They may not be the only group that's unique, but we need to study more of ourselves.
Awesome.
African lens.
That was such a great history. So much shared in that response. Thank you so much. So as we're winding down, just going to take a ask a few questions on what you're doing currently, how people can get in touch with you if they want to purchase your DVD, how might they go about doing that? And so if you just want to share a little bit about what you're currently working on and how people can get in touch with you.
Okay, well, I'm trying to become more social media literate. You know, I'm not a digital native, as you can tell. But so my website is very easy, afrodiaspora.net. And I'm in the process of doing a new website. So wait a week or so before going to that website. And ideally, by the time the new website is up, you will be able to find out how to get books, how to get documentaries, and how to be in touch with me for whatever. So what I'm doing now is doing this website, and I realize that it needs to be a way for me to share information. So I'm working on doing that. I'm also working on doing more documentaries because we need to see ourselves. You know, I've watched us see us. I remember so well a friend from Mali who was visiting, and I showed him probably some of what you just saw, familiar faces. And when he saw Juan Angola Makonde, he said, Bolivia. So whenever I think of people who you know look like our family, and they're in places where we don't think they are, I think about Bas and Bolivia. You know, this guy looked like his brother. Okay, yet he's in a place where my Malian friend wouldn't have thought there were African descendants. When I went to the Pacific coast of Colombia for the first time, I was shocked. What are these Black folks doing here? You know, another time I went to the Pacific coast of Colombia, I thought, wait a minute, where did this plane take me? Am I in Benin or am I in Cameroon? The Pacific coast of South America is so much more African than we can imagine. I'm also writing a memoir about my travels. And, you know, I realized that I expected there to be a lot more enthusiasm in the publishing world about what I'm writing, but I think I'm not writing the right story. You know, the kinds of stories that the publishing world likes to read about us is how abused we've been. Books that revel in our oppression. I don't do that. I don't do negativity. I am much more interested in talking about all that we have done in spite of. And my first trip to Cameroon just made it impossible for me to not have a Pan-Africanist worldview and to not look at us from a positive point of view, desde adentro, from the inside, telling our stories in our interests for us. I'm not, let's see, I don't spend time bad-mouthing anybody else. There's enough of that. But I figure, you know, we've done so much that should be appreciated, and we have done so much that we should be proud of. That's what I talk about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening for this wonderful, very informative discussion with Dr. Sheila Walker. We invite you out every third Wednesday here on Zoom for our IKG Wisdom Wednesday virtual webinars. Our next presentation will take place on Wednesday, March 17th, and it is featuring Dr. Coco Resillon doing part 2, and his topic will be identity and brain health during the pandemic. So he was our speaker back in December, and you all asked for him to come back to do a part 2. So he will be returning. So just want to let you all be aware of that. And before we finally close out, Dr. Walker, is there any closing thoughts that you would like to share with our audience?
Yes, basically, I think it's really important for us to understand that we're a global people. I mean, there's so many of us whose worldview is, oh, we're an oppressed minority in the United States. Well, yeah, well, that's true. But there's so much more to our story, you know? In my travels, one of the things that I found is that Africa is indeed global. When I go to Europe, I don't necessarily go to a white Europe, because there are so many African descendants in Europe that I can go to Europe and I can think I'm in Africa. When I go to India, right, I hang out with Afro-Indians. So that doesn't mean I avoid other people, but you know, it's like I'm visiting family. And I think it's very healthy for us to understand that we are part of the global African diaspora. We have a family around the world, and they want to know about us. You know, Afro descendants elsewhere in the Americas and elsewhere in the world are very interested in us from the United States because we have done so much to move the society forward. We have done so much in the civilizing mission of the Americas. So much of what is considered American culture is ours. The United States, beginning in 1956, exported what it called high culture from the United States, jazz. So how did jazz become global? The United States government acknowledged the importance of our culture as representative of the United States, and nothing has taken its place. There's nothing to replace it. So I think that it's so healthy for us to broaden our worldview and to be welcoming to other folks who look like us. I have Spanish-speaking friends, Afro descendants from the Americas, who say that US African Americans think that they're us until they start speaking Spanish, like, oh, I thought you were Black. Well, they are. And there are people in the Americas who wonder, well, why am I this color? Is it the sun? No. We need to know our story. We need to do everything we can to know our version of our story, and we need to share it with each other. So that's my mission, to share our story, our global story with us.
Wonderful. Thank you again. If you take a look in the chat, there are so many thank yous from everyone. Just saying your presentation was awesome. Thank you for enlightening us and for being on this mission. So thank you all again. I'm just going to share information about our next presentation. And let's see here. Okay. Again, Dr. Coco Recion will be on March 17th. You can join the IKG mailing list at ikgculturalresourcecenter.com and click on contact, and you will be added to our listserv to receive emails and alerts to when we have various events. And if you would like to contribute, here's the contribution page with means to donate. So thank you all again. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And if you are in the East Coast, I'm here in DC. Be safe out there. Be safe out there with the weather. So, okay. And so we are going to